Chapter 7, your asymmetric risk vehicle, triple digit ROI. I remember well the thrill of Friday nights as a kid, primarily because of two words: Blockbuster Video. If you were blessed to be a child of the 1980s, and I was, there's no doubt you can recall the feeling of going to Blockbuster. You pulled up and gazed across the parking lot of all of that glorious blue and yellow sign, a beacon of entertainment beckoning you to come try a new cinematic delight. As you walked inside, fluorescent lights illuminated the towering wall of new releases, and the center aisles were filled with old favorites. There was always the worn-out copy of Caddyshack, then there was E.T., Back to the Future, and anything by John Hughes. When in doubt, you could always fall back on the Star Wars trilogy. There used to only be 3 Star Wars movies, not like 287 like there are now. I remember the first time I saw DVDs sitting beside the VHS copies of some of the classics. I stood in amazement, wondering how in the world such a thin, tiny disc held an entire film. Back in those days, there was no button on your remote that brought up movies in 2 seconds. There were no smartphones with hundreds of different movie apps. The only mobile phones that we had required actual bags to carry the giant phone and charger. No, you went to Blockbuster, browsed, and bought Twizzlers and root beer while you were at it. Imagine my surprise when I first heard about the new company that mailed movies to you, and then you sent them right back. What sorcery is this? Who could have ever imagined such a fanciful concept? Apparently Netflix did, because even before the streaming service, Netflix had sealed Blockbuster's fate simply by figuring out a way to rent movies via snail mail. Netflix became the standard for what it means to be an industry disruptor. And for those savvy investors who bought a slice of the Netflix pie early in the game, their ROIs were in the 5 digits by the mid-2015 stock split. Imagine that you could go back to 2014 and purchase stock in Netflix before their ROI increased by 23,865%. That means that if you had bought $1,000 worth of shares in Netflix in 2014, you would have made over $230,000. What if you had predicted that Amazon would become the e-commerce hub for the planet and it would grow more than 21,487%? What if you had anticipated that Shopify was going to help small shop owners worldwide sell their products, and because of that, it would grow 6,717%? With the benefit of hindsight, it's easy for us to say, well, of course those are winners. But when these companies were first emerging, investing in them would have seemed like a risky bet to most people. Risk. It's a word that elicits many different reactions depending on how much you know about it and how you're wired. So let's talk about the word risk and why the planet's wealthiest people actively seek it out. Risk. The world's greatest investing tool. Our bodies are innately designed to respond to risky situations in 2 ways: fight or flight. So in a nutshell, risk either makes people run screaming in the other direction, or it makes them plant their feet in the arena like Russell Crowe in Gladiator. Me, I'm an arena guy. That's why I became obsessed with the concept in this chapter when one of my mentors, the legendary Ray Dalio, first explained it to me. Risk is the stuff that makes life worthwhile. Some people jump out of airplanes, and I buy shares in exciting companies within emerging markets. I highly value risk, as long as it has 2 things. It has to be intelligent, and it has to have huge potential payoffs. We're talking about race car speed growth, 3-digit and higher returns. That makes it the 3rd vehicle on our financial freedom roadmap. Here's our roadmap again for a quick reminder of where we are on the path to financial freedom. Step 1, you're reserving 20% of your income so that you can set it aside in that armor truck, right? It's your financial reserve vehicle. Then step 2, it's time to invest. Later, we're going to convert those investments into income that we can put right back in the armored truck so that we can make more investments. First, we talked about double-digit ROI. with our passive investment real estate vehicle. Now we're talking about another passive vehicle. This is your asymmetric risk vehicle for triple-digit ROI. The most intelligent risks are also going to be high risk. The reason is that low risk investments guarantee failure. I do not invest in failure. I invest in winning, which is why I actively seek out the highest risk investments. Pause. How do traditional investments fail? Low risk investments guarantee failure, but it's not failure in the traditional sense. If you have a certain goal for retirement or financial freedom, and that goal requires double-digit returns or greater to get you there, what do you call it if your returns are too low to compound and get you your desired end result? Well, I call that failure. If your plan is guaranteed to not hit the goal, then it's a broken plan. If your average ROIs are too low across the board, you'll never make it to the goal, and you're actually guaranteed to fail. If the plan or aggregate ROI is broken out the gate, don't do it. The kiddie pool is shallow. You can swim in it, sort of, and the upside is that it's tough to drown, but not impossible. It's also boring. I want to be able to dive in and swim freely. There's an inherent danger, though, to deeper waters, but that danger is necessary if you desire the financial freedom it takes to have it all. So yes, this chapter is about taking the kind of risks where you can lose. Honestly, though, this isn't as scary as it sounds. I can't guarantee anything, and neither can anyone else. It's not even a guarantee that you're going to wake up in the morning. However, the numbers, the high returns you want, heavily favor intelligent risk. Buying stock in someone else's business is all about leverage. You invest a little, other people do all the work to turn a profit, and you get to reap a percentage of the reward. It almost sounds too good to be true if we didn't already know this is how the stock market actually works. Now, I do hesitate to even use that word stock market, right? The phrase means something entirely different to me than it does to everybody else. Most people equate the stock market with S&P 500 or an IRA, an index fund, mutual funds, everything I absolutely can't stand. People think that they're ultra diversified and cleverly hedging their risk by using so many different types of investments. Let's think about the logic for a second, though. Every one of those vehicles I just listed banks its success on the exact same thing, owning a bunch of minuscule fragments of the world's biggest companies. How diversified does that actually sound to you? When you think about it, that is literally the opposite of diversified. It's also a sign that someone really doesn't understand the concept of using risk as an investment tool. Ray Dalio is the founder of the world's largest hedge fund firm, Bridgewater Associates. He has successfully managed over $140 billion for his stock market investors over the years. One of the best things he ever told me is this: having 15 different asset classes eliminates 85% of your risk. In this book, we're only talking about 4 different asset classes. Yes, there are many more, and the more ways you seek to diversify, the better. So it's time to face the music by hearing this truth. Having multiple investments based on blue chip stocks is not being diversified. It's also ironically pretty risky and not the intelligent kind. Owning multiple versions of indexes is what I consider no diversification at all. Even when you quote unquote win big, let's be honest, it's a pretty small win, especially now that we're learning how many other great investment vehicles exist. However, when you own multiple slices of various up-and-coming companies in an assortment of emerging industries, this diversification gives you multiple asset classes. I would rather have a slice of watermelon than an entire grape. I love the stock market because I live for the thrill of buying, building, and selling businesses. That is, in essence, what you're doing when you buy and sell shares. And I'm going to let you in on a little secret. The world's wealthiest people are business owners. They own their own businesses and a stake in the businesses of many others. I'm a passionate business ownership enthusiast, and if you aren't yet, I'd consider becoming one. Listen, I've attempted multiple times to build thriving, successful businesses, and it's not always easy. I've had my share of successes, but can those wins compare to those up and coming industry leaders that will eventually be household names? No, do not delude yourself. The winning approach is to own multiple businesses, including your own. Of course, if it were as easy as own a piece of other companies and get rich, then there'd be no need for this chapter. So if it isn't already clear, allow me to clarify. We're not talking about the standard methods of investing such as mutual funds, index funds, 401ks, IRAs, or the S&P 500. You'll never earn multiple digit ROIs with the obvious winners that have already emerged. The boring way versus the better way. The S&P 500 consists of the most successful 500 publicly traded companies on the planet with the absolute highest ROIs and profits. And yet, investing in these giants doesn't earn the average investor anything above single digits over an investment's lifetime. But people do it every day because it's safe and predictable. Seriously, why even bother? The most accelerated path to wealth is not littered with teeny tiny fragments of huge companies. These only serve to bring your risk so low that your ROI drops to single digits. This conventional type of investment strategy utilizes what's called symmetric risk exposure. Definition time: symmetric risk. Noun: the low risk associated with traditional investing that delivers lackluster returns but promises safety in the sense that potential gains and losses equal each other, hence symmetric. We okay so far? Here's a classic example of symmetric risk. You bet $100 on a coin toss. If it lands on heads, you win $100. But if it lands on tails, you lose $100. Because the potential gain and loss are equal to each other, you're facing a symmetric risk exposure. People are always talking about work-life balance and a balanced portfolio. We shun asymmetry, and what we seek is equilibrium. And yet most great art is asymmetrical, often profoundly so. Artists call this asymmetric balance. Think about the works of Van Gogh or Picasso. Not an ounce of traditional symmetry to be found. So maybe asymmetry isn't so bad after all. In fact, we should strive for asymmetry when it comes to the stock market. Definition: asymmetric risk. Noun: the intelligent risk an investor faces when targeting investments with high upside and low downside. Remember the Netflix example from earlier in this chapter where $1,000 in 2014 increased to $230,000? Well, if Netflix went to zero, you would be out $1,000. But instead, it went up 230 times. This is a classic example of low downside, right? Losing your small investment, and high upside, multiplying your money many times over. In the 1949 book, The Intelligent Investor, Benjamin Graham, the father of value investing, said, quote, "The essence of portfolio management is the management of risks, not returns," end quote. Traditional investors focus on returns rather than risk. And by focusing both on the risk and the returns, you can find ways to maximize your returns while you simultaneously minimize your risks. In other words, when you utilize asymmetric risk, your shares can go down 100%, but your growth is unlimited. Asymmetric risk is an intelligent risk because it looks at the big picture and systematically weighs the pros and the cons. Using an established system enables you to rely not on emotion or hunches, but on research, logic, and mathematics. That being said, there's still a place for safe traditional investments that provides a stable return. And guess what? It's for those who are already extremely wealthy. You see, when people with large sums of money do not require growth, but consistency, they can turn to single-digit ROI models. However, it is not for those who are in the wealth accumulation phase. The quest for moonshots. Ironically, asymmetric risk also relies on losing as a fundamental part of the strategy. If you do it correctly, you will lose a majority of the time, which also means that it has to be money that you're willing to lose. It's counterintuitive, to be sure. So, how did Ray Dalio become one of the most successful hedge fund managers of all time through the use of asymmetric risk? He explained the principle to me in a very simple manner. Imagine you have $500 to invest in the stock market. After some research, you discover 5 companies who meet all of your criteria for asymmetric risk investments, but are not yet in the spotlight. Let's assume your criteria of asymmetric risk is to pick companies that can go up 500% or multiply 5 times. You invest $100 in each of these 5 companies. And here's the end result. Company number 1 that you invested $100 in, where you were hoping for a 500% return, meaning I was hoping that $100 would increase 5 times to $500. Let's assume it goes to 0. Okay, investment number 2, I put $100 in there. I thought it would go up 5 times, but it also went to 0. The third one that I put $100 in, let's assume it also goes to 0. And the fourth one as well. But on the 5th investment where you placed $500 into a company hoping for a 5x return or a 500% increase, let's assume it did just that. Let's assume that your 5th and final investment went from $100 to a $500 return. With that one investment of $500 split 5 ways, you created a 500% ROI on one of your $100 investments. So basically, you broke even. And you also accomplished this even though 4 out of 5 investments were total duds. Now imagine that 2 of your $100 investments each delivered a 500% ROI. In other words, both produced $500. So you took the initial $500, the total investment spread out over 5 companies, and you made a total of $1,000 despite losing $300 of your original $500 investment. This represents a net 100% ROI, and yet you're losing more than half the time. That is the essence of asymmetric risk exposure, and it's brilliant. The key in this example is that 2 investments that won were 500% ROI investments. In reality, the higher the potential ROI, the better. And 500%, honestly, that's just the beginning.